companies were not
really
wanting
wanting
to
to
invest in
invest
full-time
in
employees.
so
So
excited
looking at
about
how
the
can they more effectively use
So I did do a little bit of research
and
and I was
people
reading
and bringing those special skills as
and
and
how
when
you
they
can
need them
thrive
rather
in
than
this
Where
brave
does this come
new
from?
world.
Where does it start?
Welcome to Crosstalk. In this first season, we'll cover the changing relationship between the employer and the employee, bring you expert analysis and debate. We get behind the headlines and dive into the hype. We assess how this impacts your HR strategy and how you can thrive in this brave new world.
Oh, I'm getting excited already, Martin.
Hold on to your seat, Nicola. This is only the first one. On Crosstalk today, we have Luke Talbot, Nicola Matson, that's the excited one, and Julie Brophy, as well as myself, Martin Rover Parks. Today's subject is the gig economy. Who cares?
I guess we could also say, who cares wins, Martin. The gig economy is rapidly transforming the workplace and disrupting HR strategies. McKinsey say that the percentage of the total labour force that are independent workers has been underestimated and could be as high as 20 to 30%, so nearly a third in the US and some parts of the European Union. That raises the important challenges for organisations looking to perform while they transform, such as what is the impact on culture when people are with you for shorter periods of time, when they check in and check out much more frequently? Is there anything you can do to engage this transient workforce or these giggers, or are they simply focused on themselves? Do they not care? And with the fluidity of the gig economy, how can you ensure your brand and reputation become a magnet to attract the best giggers time and time again? So turning to you, Julie, I think I'm in need of a history lesson. We've heard a lot about the gig economy. We see it referenced a lot. We're talking about it a lot today. Right. But where does this come from? Where does it start? And when do we first start to hear about the gig economy as a thing?
Well, the term gig economy started to really come into fruition in about 2009 after the global financial crisis. Companies were not really wanting to invest in full-time employees, so we're looking at how can they more effectively use part-time people and bring in those special skills as and when they need them rather than invest in that or in a full-time person. So it's around about 2009, but actually the term comes from gig, from the French, which is about short-term dance engagement, so you can see where that
and I guess if we call this the gig economy, it would be doing an entirely different crosstalk.
Absolutely, right? We'd be talking about can-can and all kinds of things, but we're not. Interestingly for me, I started my career in about the late 70s and 80s, and even then I was working with contractors who were brought in for a 6-month period to bring in special skills or knowledge specifically needed at certain points in time in a project, and then they would leave. So in those days, we called them contractors. The kind of terms that are being used now, more recently, are things like contingent workers, independent workers, or one of my favourite, which is free-range humans.
As opposed to battery humans.
Yeah,
Images of us all in cages looking out with a little laptop.
That's right.
It's only a matter of time, Martin.
But I think also one of the things that's happening is, as we're talking about this more and more in the media, it's being associated with people like Deliveroo and Uber.
Yeah, and I think, Julie raises a good point. I think the context in which we see gig economy used more and more frequently is in that sort of low-paid, low-skilled type work, the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Deliveroos and so forth. But actually, that isn't the type of role that comprises what is actually a growing sector within the economy. I did a little bit of preparation because I was so excited about the first episode of Crosstalk. So I did do a little bit of research, and I was reading about a survey that RSA conducted. And it was the...
Wait, is that the Royal Sun Alliance?
It is not Royal Sun Alliance.
The Republic of South Africa?
No more takers. It is the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce.
Well, I can imagine why they stuck with RSA then.
So RSA conducted this survey in conjunction with Ipsos Mori, maybe a more familiar name to our listeners. And they conducted the biggest survey looking specifically at the UK gig economy. And what they found was 59% of those people in the UK gig economy actually provide professional, creative and administrative services. It's actually only 16% that do the sort of driving and delivery that we sometimes tend to think of when we hear the term, and the rest was comprised of sort of skilled manual and professional roles. Another stat I read that I found quite surprising is that 44% of the British gig economy workers have degrees. So I think in an ideal world, the model would be one that consisted of independent workers that have the flexibility to choose the right work-life balance, the right positions that they're interested in, rather than this sort of perception of low-paid workers scrabbling around for any crappy work that they can get to make ends meet.
Oh, sounds like we're already shattering a couple of myths here. So
We are the Mythbusters.
possibly copyrighted, so let's not go there. So it's already shattering some myths. So the first one being that coming into this, so while we were doing the prep for this, I imagined that actually we were talking mostly about low paid, generally low value, sort of quite volume work. And that doesn't appear to be the case. We're talking about things that actually involve high levels of skill and value to the organisation, which I think we'll go into later on as well. But what about age? What about the kind of people doing this work? So the assumption being that this is mostly millennials.
And I actually had the same assumption. I think I'm playing the role of naysayer here, or maybe bookworm, one of the two. But also, whilst doing some research for this episode, as I say, I went into it with the same perception. I expected it to be mostly comprised of millennial workers, but actually the research doesn't support that. One of the pieces that I was reading was published by Katz and Kruger, and they actually showed that it wasn't this sort of struggling millennial that I think we tend to think of, and actually it was more represented by the 60-year-old plus independent contractors, and that's actually backed up by PwC's recent Future of Work report. And they've found that when they spoke to the younger workers, what they're actually looking for is job security. And it was more the older workforce that had more of a desire to go into that independent contracting, probably in part due to the fact that they have a level of financial security that maybe the younger people don't have currently. So I think when you think about that gig economy, it's more of an hourglass, albeit a bit of a top heavy, maybe a bit of a Jessica Rabbit hourglass. And at the top of that hourglass, we've got the highly skilled, sought after individuals. They're looking for flexibility. They're looking for work-life balance. Unfortunately, what we do tend to see at the bottom of that hourglass tends to be the more insecure work, low paid work, often represented through temporary and 0-hour contracts.
If you've got thoughts and feelings on this, do drop us a line. Join the debate at questback.com. For now, going back to the gig economy, though, I think there's a definition that we can all agree on here. And that's jobs that are done by part-timers, freelancers, temps, contractors, the young, the old. So, Julie, I'll fire a question in your direction. Is this just a fad?
As I said, I've been experiencing contractor work for a very long time, but what interests me is why we're talking about it so much. So if this has been around for a long time, what is it that's happened that means that this is in the press and we're actually having these kind of conversations about the gig economy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that one thing that's emerging now, there are probably two dimensions to it. One is that this is a growing trend. So we're seeing an increasing number of people involved in this kind of work. I think it's a 2016. I'm going to look at my notes now. The 2016 report from Ernst & Young that said that in the US, the contingent workforce had increased by 66% in the past decade. So that's, I would probably suggest, quite a high increase. In the UK, that was 28%, so slightly less, but still quite marked. And if we think before at the McKinsey research that I pointed to right at the very beginning, that up to a third of your workforce might actually be comprised of this contingent workforce. So we can see this is now a growing trend. It's been around forever, this type of work, but it's increasing. But the other thing that we need to think about is also technology is starting to come of age. So at the same time, you now have the rise of a plethora of different platforms on which people can actually do this work, and I think that's a big difference. Those platforms are coming. They're useful to giggers because giggers obviously want to go somewhere so they can get work, and they're useful to organisations because they want to go to a single place so they can find people.
My own personal experience, you talked about employers going to these platforms to find resources. I needed to do some video work quite recently. I had 24 hours to find a videographer. I expected to go old school and email 10, 15 people, but actually within my first Google search, I found a platform dedicated to those types of skills and resources, put in the details of my job, and I had 6 quotes within 2 hours.
Yeah. And that leads to looking at the positives and the negatives. Nicola, what are they?
Well, I think the positives, probably everybody listening to this are pretty familiar with now. It's pretty well documented. But if we look at the positives from an employer perspective, it's that increased flexibility and responsiveness, the ability to scale up and scale down the workforce as and when demands come across. There's cost management benefits, so some organisations preferring to pay purchase orders, rather than having people permanently on payroll. There's cost savings, often less office space, less benefits. What I see written a lot is less cost on training. That's a bit of an emotive one for me because I think potentially we could be missing a trick there. Maybe we can look at this later, but I do think there are ways that we could offer potentially training 2-hour gig workers. But there's a lot of benefits from the employer's perspective. From an employee standpoint, the most obvious one is flexibility. People talk about this work-life balance. And again, I'm probably talking about the top end of that hourglass, maybe not so much the bottom. But they get that flexibility. However, with that, again, it's a double-edged sword. If we think about the negatives from the employee's perspective, is yes, they get flexibility. They've got less security. They've got less structure. Potentially leads them to be a bit more individualistic in their approach, which could lead them to have less concern about the long-term success of an organisation. And from the employer's perspective, on a very practical level, think about maybe being a hiring manager. How do you create that team cohesion, a sense of belonging, a sense of culture? If you've regularly got people joining for a short period of time and then leaving, I think it makes it much more difficult. And when we think about that, people coming and going and the frequency with which that will happen with your gig workers on those short-term contracts, it gives us many, many opportunities to get things right. Unfortunately, it also gives us as many opportunities to get things wrong. So I think we really need to think about the experience that we're offering those gig workers in the same way that we think about that experience for payroll. Because if we do get it wrong, I think that can have a pretty detrimental impact on the organisation.
I think that's really true. So if you think about customer experience, we already know, it's quite common knowledge that people tend to share a negative experience much more readily than a positive experience. I think that says a lot about human nature and the fact that we might want to, quite happy to warn everyone around us about things that they shouldn't be doing, but maybe we'll keep some of the good things to ourselves a little bit more. Maybe we can discuss the psychology of that in another crosstalk, but completely unrelated. But we know that's the same for employees. And going back to technology, 15, 20 years ago maybe is more accurate. This would have impacted, if I had a negative experience with an employer, that would impact maybe just the people around me in my immediate vicinity, my family, friends. 10 years ago, we start to see LinkedIn. It's going to affect the people I've worked with or I've dealt with before, and they might start to see it. But now, with the advent of some platforms that are much more social and much more anonymous, you're starting to see this affect the entire world. So you think about things like Glassdoor, for instance, and now people are starting to leave reviews on companies, 5-star reviews, in the same way that they would a hotel or a holiday. Now, it's easy to say that this might not impact your organisation, but it probably will. What we know, there's one study I was looking at that said that over 50% of people, when looking for a job, actually check Glassdoor first, and 30% of people, potential employees, won't actually even apply to a company if they have anything less than a 3-star rating. So they need 3 stars or above for them to apply. But let's also think about what work these people are doing. You mentioned it yourself. You went to a specific platform to find those giggers. And now we're seeing, outside of things like Glassdoor, which are very generic, the rise of platforms where you can find people. So we were looking at a few earlier. One that I saw, the Hourly Nerd, is my particular favorite.
I wonder why that is.
I just love the name. There's Top Coder, Tongle. There are lots of different, a plethora of different platforms now that bring all of the giggers of a certain type and certain type of work to one place, both for their benefit and the benefit of employees looking for them. And if they have a negative experience, they're going to share that within that community. And that's going to really impact your ability to not just get them back and get the top giggers back, but also even just hiring your normal payrolled employees as well.
Yeah.
So, a quick fire question here, actually, before. Who here has gone on Glassdoor before they applied for a job?
I'm raising my hand and realising that people on the audio on the podcast can't see that, but I actually looked up Questback on Glassdoor, and I am here now as an employee because of the positive reviews that I saw.
Yeah, and I'm going to point out that you raised your hand so that people on the podcast didn't notice, but people watching the video will notice you didn't raise your hand. So, which is absolutely fine.
My
and
hand
you're raising your hand.
is raised.
So I of course looked on Glassdoor, because why wouldn't you? I mean, you'd have to be a complete lunatic to go and stay in a hotel without checking TripAdvisor. So why on earth would you look at a company without checking Glassdoor? I mean, that's my personal feeling.
Well, it's a much bigger investment you're making into a
career
career than a one-night stay in a hotel.
One of them's a bad night with dirty sheets, and the other's... Julie, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I use Glassdoor.
Martin?
Yes, I used Glassdoor. Then I had the interview and thought, oh dear. But overall, it's good. Good impression.
I'd like to say that other review sites are available.
Kanunu. Anyway, just taking a step back for a minute, I think one of the things that really struck me when I was doing some preparation for this episode is I started thinking about all of the time and the money and the energy that organisations invest in their payroll staff. And I've got a background in talent acquisition. I know we've got occupational psychologists, we've got people with feedback expertise. We talk a lot about motivating our employees, engaging them, building a brand that will attract them and retain them. But it's nearly always in the context of those payrolled individuals. What I sort of don't understand really is why we're excluding this gig community from those different sort of processes and investments. Typically, we're not onboarding giggers, and actually there was an EY report that said 55% of the companies polled don't offer any type of onboarding for their contingent workers. We're often not asking for their feedback, and we often don't recognise them beyond paying them. There are so many other ways that we can reward and recognise people outside of paying their contract, and again, typically those giggers are excluded, and I think that's a mistake that we're making.
Julie, does this ring true?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one exception I have seen was a travel company that had seasonal workers, and they ran a very good alumni for those workers. So they would stay in contact with people. When they brought them in to start the seasonal work, they actually had specific onboarding for them. So it was a shortened version, but it was very much focused on the skills that they needed to have as seasonal workers, but also did the vision and the values and the customer focus and what we're expecting to deliver. So they were well prepared when they went out to do the seasonal work. The thing I really liked about them was they kept in contact afterwards, so that kept down their recruitment costs, but it also brought back people who had already had experience of that organisation, so they were very engaged. They would do things like if they had an internal training course and there were 2 or 3 places available, they would offer them to their giggers. What they did as well was if you'd been back 2 or 3 times, if they saw a good external training course they thought would be useful to you, they would notify you, but they also subsidised slightly that training. So you got incentivised to come back. I think going back to one of the things that Nicola said about the difference between giggers and full-time employees is over the last 50 years there's been lots of occupational psychology research, and essentially 3 things are needed at work for you to become engaged to, and that's having meaning and structure to your work. The second one is belonging and the camaraderie that you get from your teams, and also feeling valued in your work, so recognised for the value that you're bringing to the organisation. And none of the research that's coming out is showing that giggers are any different.
Okay, so and I get that, and I think for your salaried or payrolled employees or full-time employees or however we want to refer to them, I can completely see how having meaning, structure, camaraderie, a sense of belonging and value and support, I think that makes sense. But for someone who's just going to come in for a few months,
but if you go back to one of the things we were talking about is what do you bring giggers in for? You bring them in for specific skills and knowledge that you don't have in the organisation, that you don't want to invest in fully, but you want to invest in over a period of time. So if you're going to bring that valuable asset in, why would you not make it so that the environment enables them to give as much as they can? So
and I think also, as Julie said, without wanting to sound trite, people are people. These people are no different, whether they're working for you for 3 months, for 8 months or 10 years. As Julie said, fundamentally, we're all looking for the same things in the work that we deliver. Now, in order to foster the right environment to support that with gig workers, I think we need to make some accommodations and changes to processes and practices and technologies that we have in place now. But if it really is going to be 30% of our workforce, I think it would be foolish not to try and address those practical issues that we need to overcome to give them the right working environment.
I've got a real example from my own experience working in a multi-billion-dollar business, an entire business division, the marketing, the content, the strategy, that was all with a group of giggers in a castle. It was called The Castle on the outskirts of London, so a completely different location, 6 people, and they were responsible for core areas within our marketing strategy, within our communication strategy with our clients and with our end customers. And the beauty there was, depending on the workload, 6 more would join, or if there wasn't enough, that would go down to 3. So that gave the flexibility, the skills, the knowledge for the business, and also addressed the needs of those that wanted to work in that industry. So yeah, absolutely, it's got my vote.
So, okay, I agree. We need to find some way of engaging these people, bringing them into the fold, motivating them that's aligned with the same way that we do it with our full-time employees, our payroll employees. So, Nicola, you've mentioned in the past, we need to try to find a way of making a collection of people a collective. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. We need to focus on culture and, dare I say it, become a bit more tribal. the thing I'm going to raise now, another bit of an issue that I foresee, is that actually, let's just focus on one way that we do this with our existing employees, or our payrolled employees, which is the annual survey. So the annual survey is sort of, a very common way of engaging with the workforce. But just the technology, the process, seems to preclude this big cohort of employees who are working for us on a short-term basis.
Well, I don't think it needs to exclude all of them. I can see, there's a practical consideration that, let's say you've got people that are working 3-month contracts. At whatever point in time you conduct your annual survey, potentially a lot of those people have left. And Julie's the psychology expert, so she can maybe talk about the validity of getting feedback from people who've maybe left the organisation 6 months ago and worked for 3 other employers. I suspect that wouldn't be particularly useful because they're not going to remember.
Even if you remember their email address, there's no point sending them a survey 6 months after they've left, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, if it is this 20 to 30% of your workforce that's sort of turning over time, at any point in time when you run that survey, you will still have a large proportion of your workforce that fit within that gig economy definition. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be sending out the engagement survey to those people that are currently employed with you at that time. I think actually that feedback's critical if we are recognising the importance and the value of that section of your workforce. We need to look at what they think of or think about their experiences so that we can make sure that we improve them and have a more inclusive approach to our feedback practices.
So when should you be listening to your giggers?
All the time.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's really happened in the market over the last few years is people are moving away from the annual survey. There is still absolutely value in asking all of your employees a series of questions at the same point in time. But if you look at the way that the market is going, we're really talking about now establishing an ongoing dialogue with employees. It doesn't rely on a once-a-year survey. So you might have quarterly pulse surveys when you're asking about specific issues, or if you've introduced an initiative, how that initiative is making improvements. You've also got things like beat surveys or very sort of quick surveys which are on demand. I just want to ask a couple of questions of my team or my group. You can send that out to a small population and get that feedback very quickly. One of the other things, of course, you have is the always on surveys. So employees don't have to be invited to give feedback. They're just encouraged to give feedback as and when it applies. So they may want to come back on an idea, or they might want to look at an obstacle that's stopping them from doing their job very well. So you don't need to actually have to wait to be invited. You can just put mechanisms in place, which means you're listening all the time.
I like that example of always on, because there are already some mechanisms for always on that most or many organisations will have. Sometimes it's a legal or even a compliance issue. The most obvious one being whistleblowing, and that is always an always-on mechanism, right? You would never have that as a scheduled thing or calendar-driven. It's not like, hey guys, it's Tuesday, time to blow the whistle. Yeah. So that's always on. So we just need to think of other mechanisms like that for organisations, because they would be naturally more inclusive.
I think one of the...
Sorry, there you go.
I was just saying, one of the key things, though, is when you do that, there needs to be the mechanism behind it, or the process behind it, that actually says, what are we going to do with this feedback? Because when you ask a question, you are setting up an expectation that something will be done about it. And one of the things you can do, and I wouldn't recommend this at a team level, but at a higher level within the organisation, is actually putting in an indicator of whether or not people are gig or whether or not they're full-time employees. And then you can look at what are the issues that are coming out of those two populations, and can we address them by one consistent approach, or do we actually need to take an approach which is slightly different for the giggers as well? So you're getting the feedback, you are acting upon it, but it may be that there are subtle differences about the two different groups that you're looking at.
And also really simply think about the types of insights that we're going to miss if we don't get feedback from those individuals, because they're potentially working for our competitors, they're out in the marketplace, they're potentially more current and up to date. So I think there's a lot that we can learn as an employer from those individuals that we don't, if we don't tap into that feedback. But also agree with everything we've said about having a more open culture, including those gig workers in those feedback mechanisms. And obviously we're a feedback company, so that's our area of focus. But I think it's too narrow a focus for organisations as a whole to consider. I think there are a number of different things we need to address. One is, as we've talked about, getting their feedback. But the other is that concept that Julie talked about wanting to belong and have a sense of camaraderie. Now, how do we allow collaboration and facilitate that sort of that sense of team for people who potentially aren't in the office? There are different technology platforms that are available to support it, both from a social standpoint, but also from a practical work perspective. I think we need to look at that collaboration piece. I also think we need to look at the reward and recognition. the only way really that we recognise gig workers typically in most organisations is to pay them. If you think about your payroll staff, hopefully most organisations go above and beyond just paying them their salary. So I've worked for a number of companies that had great technologies in place that allowed you to send sort of e-thanks that would notify the manager. There'd be sort of leaderboards where people could see, you know, who'd given them praise. But typically those gig workers were excluded from them.
Yes, absolutely. So I think we've explored a number of things here. Let's bring it back to those original questions that we asked. Thinking about the impact on culture where people are with you for shorter periods of time. I'll open it up to the floor. They come and go more frequently. What are our thoughts on this?
I feel like I've spoken a lot already, but anyway.
I think, Nicola, you need to take this one.
I think the practicalities are that it will become harder and harder for organisations to maintain a culture. And I think we've talked in the past about culture being something that changes quite slowly. I think we're going to see that change as organisations become more and more fluid and people are coming and going at a more rapid rate. And if you don't have that prospect of long-term employment, how do you get buy-in and a sense of caring about the organisation? I love this expression that I read. There was an article and it was talking about this fluid nature of the workforce, and it talked about the employee life cycle being on steroids, which I really liked, because yes, there are differences, but pretty much it's the same process, it's just condensed. And I think from a culture perspective, particularly for gig workers who are going to comprise a larger percentage of the workforce over time, we need to make sure that we bring culture in at every point in that interaction and those touch points. So we need to talk about it during recruitment, during onboarding, and also we need to recognise the impact that these people leaving has on our culture. So don't hide the fact that you've got people coming and going, have handovers, bring people back who've worked for you before to talk about their experiences, but also identify the more consistent members of your workforce, so typically leaders, but people who are staying with the organisation, and get them to become storytellers or narrators of what that culture is. But for me, I think the key thing, which I sort of mentioned already, is to have a culture within an organisation where the individual success is integrated into the organisation's success, and vice versa, a sort of symbiosis whereby I'm compelled to help the organisation because it's helping me as well.
Good point.
What about engaging with giggers? Are they simply focused on themselves, Julie?
No, I don't think they are at all. They are looking for the same kind of things as every other employee, that they're looking for this meaning and this structure, being valued, being part of the team. So I think really what we need to do is treat them as you treat all your other employees, listen to them. We've already discussed the fact that an annual survey is not going to work, especially when you've got a gig economy. So design yourself a voice of the employee listening strategy rather than just relying on the annual survey, and really find a place for them to collaborate and be a member of the team so that they can bring that need for the camaraderie and contribute to your teams very quickly. As Nicola said, you've got these people flowing, so it's going to be about constructing teams and supporting teams so that they can very quickly come together, become a team, have this joint valued work that they're going to work towards so that people can add value.
Absolutely.
And what was that story? So the story about the Christmas party. Who had that?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's one of our colleagues, but he was saying that when he worked as a contractor, he was actually in the office on site, and they'd sent a survey to all of the payroll employees asking them to vote whether or not the contractual staff should be allowed to attend the Christmas party.
Nice.
They did, thankfully, say yes, although I think it was self-funded. People just see that as a cost that's not worth it because those people aren't with us for 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, and I think certainly, I mean, if I'm an employee from November to January, and that's the contract I'm on, I can just imagine how disengaged I'd be on January the 2nd if I came back and everyone around me is talking about this amazing Christmas party that I wasn't invited to, despite the amazing work I've been doing. So
exactly.
Maybe not the focus on how engaged they might be, but how disengaged they may become.
Mm-hmm.
So Luke, talking about engagement and Christmas parties, we look at the fluidity of the gig economy. How can you ensure your brand and your reputation become a magnet to attract the best talent? And that's not just beating the piñata or going for a beer. Time and time again. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think we've covered it pretty well, I think, a couple of times. And it's to do with providing an excellent experience from start to finish. And that needs to focus on the journey. The journey for your giggers is going to be very different maybe in some ways in terms of the timeline and the rapidity. We used a different word earlier. What did you use?
It was life cycle on steroids.
A life cycle on steroids, which I quite like. So it's the same thing, but it's just very very, very concentrated. And actually focusing on that will ensure that people have a great experience. And I think if that experience is great consistently, then that will you're not in control of what people say about you on Glassdoor, but you are in control of the experience you try and give them and how much you try to improve that.
I think it's fair to say that all boils down to a valuable contribution, that the gig economy is here to stay, that it's a growing trend. They contribute to your business, and there are huge advantages here. I don't think we've got any disagreements on that if we were to summarise what this crosstalk, this first crosstalk's been about.
Exactly. I mean, in a line, if you do care, you will win.
Fantastic. All of that segues nicely to the next crosstalk, all about millennials like me.
No,
It doesn't segue to that at all.
We just debunked the millennial.
All right, don't pick on me.
Oh, do you want a hug?
Well, actually, that is, we do talk about that in the next
segue.
crosstalk. That is a good segue. Hug a millennial. They need feedback 4 times a day. Thanks to Luke, Nicola, Julie. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you to our audience. Please do get involved. Join the debate at questback.com, and we'll see you next time. Do tune in.